In this brief amount of time that we'll be spending this morning together, what I'm going to do is highlight a number of take-home messages that come from science and try to make the bridge to practical applications, but in really these outline kinds of ways, because this talk could actually take 8 hours. So in less than an hour, it's going to be a challenge for all of us to make sure that what we're going to have a conversation about and connect with each other about is understood, and then you can also see the implications of it. So the place that we begin is just to know from where these statements are going to come from. And they come from this field called interpersonal neurobiology, which is basically an effort to take all the disciplines of science and combine them into one. So it's not the same as social neuroscience, which is a branch of neuroscience, which is a branch of biology. Interpersonal neurobiology, that name I made up to mean the whole of science. So it's what's called, what E.O. Wilson would call a consilient approach. And we have now almost 36 textbooks that I've overseen the editing of with Norton. So if you're interested in reading more, there's lots of reading to do. If you want to just get one book that summarizes the whole thing, The Pocket Guide to Interpersonal Neurobiology would be a place to dive in. And its companion book, The Developing Mind, the second edition, would be the more linear book. The Pocket Guide is a non-linear book you kind of create as you go. So there's all that, there's all the online things, there's lots of things to do. So let me outline the take-home points. And it really starts with a fundamental question that I'd like you to consider as you sit there, and which is, who are you? You're sitting right here, right now, and you have a subjective experience of sitting there. You have consciousness, you have thoughts, you have feelings, you have memories, you have all sorts of things that are in your experience. And when we use the word MIND, which, by the way, has no definition in the major fields, including education, or psychology, or psychiatry, or even philosophy of mind. And if you take that word MIND, which has no definition, and yet you know that it has something in it, right? It has your subjective experience. So how many of you right now feel that even though you're not looking at me, you know I'm back here? Okay, so that's that sense of knowing, people would say is a part of your mental life, that sense of knowing within awareness. Now, the first take-home point we want to say is that subjective experience, while it's something that we know we have, amazingly, it actually can't really be known by anyone else. You can, if you're an artist, paint a picture. If you're a songwriter, like my son, you can write a song and write music. If you're a painter, you can paint, sculpt, you can write poetry, you can write novels, you can do all sorts of things. But those are your attempt to communicate something inside. So something that really befuddles scientists is that you can't quantify this thing called subjective experience. And yet if you had to summarize all of the field I'm trained in, attachment research, it would be that parents or any caregivers who see the subjective inner life of a child give that child a set of experiences that will optimize their development. So we say in attachment, the important thing is to be seen. And the northern Natal in South Africa that Linda Lantier beautifully talked to us about last night, say, I see you. Right? And so from the deepest, deepest level of starting with this word mind, mind is subjective experience. That's pretty much what people have a description of it. It's also consciousness, and there are non-conscious things going on. So even though scientists can't quantify subjective experience, they attempt to study it, which is really good, and sometimes they even give up the study of it, which can be a problem. Okay, So subjective experience is what we mean by mind. We also mean consciousness. Now, the intriguing thing about the word mind is, as you heard, in some cultures, there is no separate definition for the word heart and mind. Apparently in Eastern languages, for example, heart and mind are the same. So I want to make it clear from the beginning that in attempting to wrestle with this word mind, we are not separating feelings from thoughts and saying thoughts are the mind and feelings are your heart. In this use of the word, anyone can use a word however they feel like it, but for this presentation, what I'm saying is that the mind is your subjective experience, it's your consciousness. And that is a starting place for descriptions, because actually if we said what is consciousness, that's like a huge topic. But the mind is also a third thing, which is going to be our main focus for today's talk about how education can honor the mind and not only try to have things about the mind. Like, how many of you have read the book called Mind, Brain, and Education Sciences? Anyone read that book? Fascinating book. Mind, Brain, and Education Sciences. Beautiful compilation of work from the Harvard program, I think, of the same name. And what's fascinating is they have a glossary of all the terms, which is great, of course. So I was really excited because I've asked 100,000 mental health professionals, and way less than 5% ever were given a talk on what the mind is. And in the field of mental health, the health of the mind, there is no definition of the mind, which is, we're kind of out of our minds to do that. So here's this major document from the field of education, and in that book, the glossary has a definition of everything. And what do you think they wrote for the entry for mind, the first word in the title of the book? They forgot to put it in. It was not put in there. Now, I see some people can't see me, so I would rather be there among you, but I'm going to stand up here. Is that better for you? Yeah. Okay, so this issue is really interesting. A book with mind as the first word in the title forgot to put it in. So it's really interesting. So, you know, this is a really, really amazing moment for me, because once I was standing out there in a seminar here with a bunch of experts on different things about mindfulness, and they said one should never define the word mind. It should never be defined. And I'm going to suggest to you as our first major take-home point that the field of education, and let me ask you just for fun, let's just ask you, how many of you would say you are in the field of education? Raise your hand. Okay, so it's basically everyone. So how many of you had a lecture that defined what the mind is? Raise your hand, please. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6. And how many people are in the room? 130. Who's good at math? What's 6 out of 130? Less than 5%. This is, okay, so now I've asked 4,130 educators, and it's always 5% or less. Same with mental health professionals, everywhere around this planet. Yet how many of you would say in your work as educators, one of the main things you're trying to develop is the mind of your student, whatever age they are? Raise your hand. So this is something strange. I'm primarily coming from the field of mental health. You know, I trained in medicine, pediatrics, psychiatry, et cetera. And I trained in research and child development, looking at how the mind develops of the child within families. But there was no definition of the mind, which seemed kind of odd. And yet it turns out that in all these fields, there is no definition of the mind. I hang out with chair people of philosophy, psychology, psychiatry, and I go to dinner with them, give them a little wine, make sure we talk openly. I said, is there a definition? No. So here's the definition I'm going to offer you. As a starting point for a quick lecture, this usually would have a 2-hour preamble before I would come to this definition, but in this setting, we don't have that luxury. But in this setting, let's just come to the punchline, the joke. So yes, the mind, a description of the mind is consciousness for sure. Fascinating, we don't know exactly what it is. Subjective experience, amazing, amazing, amazing. We don't really know exactly what it is, but we know what it is. Here's the third aspect of mind. This is not to replace explorations of consciousness or exploration of subjective experience. Maybe they're overlapping, maybe not. We'll see how that comes out in our discussion together. But here's a third aspect of mind. I'm going to give it to you straight. It's going to seem like the most abstract, useless piece of junk you've ever heard, and I honor that response. And in fact, after we describe the implications for education, you may say, that is really useless, and I don't want to think about that anymore. And that's fine. However, there is a possibility that there may be something useful in it, and so let's see how it goes. So I'm not going to give you all the backstory. Here's just the definition that we've been using in our field, interpersonal neurobiology. Here's how it goes. And I'm going to give you a teeny bit of a feeling for why this definition exists. How many of you feel that your subjective experience and what you're conscious of is influenced by your relationships with other people? Raise your hand. Okay. So from that response, you can tell that any attempt to define the mind needs to have relationships front and center inside of it. You see? Okay. How many of you think if you don't sleep for days at a time and you don't eat anything, or your head gets wonked, or something that affects the physiology of your body, how many of you feel that your subjective experience and consciousness, including your thoughts and feelings and attitudes, intentions, hopes, dreams, longings, desires, all that stuff that we know as descriptions of the mind, how many of you feel that if your physiology of your body is affected, it affects your mind? Raise your hand. Okay. So we need to have some definition that somehow has relationships and the body front and center. Does that make sense? So when you're trained, as I was in medicine, and you are trained by neuroscientists, my professor of neuroscience got the Nobel Prize when I was in medical school, David Hubel. And so we were taught in those days, this is back in 1978 and 79, we were taught that, ultimately one would find that the mind was just brain activity. That's kind of the stance that you actually hear now. Yet brain activity is about ions flowing in and out of membranes and chemicals being released at the ends of the connections, the synapses, right? And you have 100 billion of them up in the head, and they're, average of 10,000 connections each neuron. So that's trillions of connections, and there are supportive cells called glial cells. You don't even need to worry about that, except to say that the brain's firing is not subjective experience. They may be completely correlated, and maybe it even causes subjective experience. I'm not sure. No one actually knows the answer to that question. They may be completely co-arising, but they're not the same. It would be like having a coin and saying, I have one coin, here's the heads, here's the tails, the heads is the tails. Right? It could be one thing, but two aspects of one thing. We don't know. But to say that subjective experience is neural firing doesn't make sense. Neural firing are ions going in and out, transmitters being released. So when we say that the body is affecting the mind, that's really, really important. There's no question. You do something to the body or you whack the brain, the mind is absolutely affected. But in my field, attachment, we can show that you do something to a parent, you make that parent seriously depressed, and you will affect the mind of the child, not only in the moment, but how that child will develop throughout the lifespan. You remove that mother, as we do in all sorts of different kinds of studies, and you will affect not only the way the connections in the brain develop, you'll actually affect the molecules that regulate gene expression, called epigenetic regulators. You will affect those for the rest of the child's life. So relationships and the body are important. So what do we do with this issue? So here's the definition. The system that connects a body and a relationship is comprised of an essence that is completely scientifically founded, but often never talked about. So as an educator, as we're getting ready to say this definition, right? See, if I just said it, you just write it down and forget it. Now you're saying, what the heck is it? Why doesn't it get to it? So in this definition, I'm going to ask you, because you're going to help me construct it, what's the essence of what in the world could combine a relationship you have as a teacher in a classroom with what in the world is happening in the body, including the brain, which is a part of the extended nervous system, which is part of the whole body. And my daughter says, never say the word embodied brain And I said to her, she's 18, so you can imagine how she says this with her eyes rolling and everything. She says, never say it. I say, why can't I say it? She says, because it's redundant. Have you ever seen a brain without a body? And I said, well, you're right, but usually when people say brain, they mean the stuff up in the head. She goes, well, yeah, but of course it's connected to the whole body. I said, well, most people don't think that way. So when we're going to use the word brain, we're going to remember it's the embodied brain, but don't tell my daughter I said that. It's always about this whole context, the physiological context in which the brain is up in the head is functioning. Okay, so for short, we'll just call it brain. Okay, so what's the essence of what happens in the brain, the embodied brain, and what happens right now between me and you, or what happens between a teacher and a student in a classroom? Let's reflect on that for a moment. If the mind, as we've already kind of clarified in our discussion, is somehow profoundly influenced by both physiological things in the body and relational things in the interpersonal world, what do they share in common? I mean, the first time I presented this was in Eastern Europe, and one of my co-faculty came to me and he said, you're out of your mind. I said, well, I might be out of my mind, but why are you saying it? He said, because you said relationships and brain in the same slide, you know. I said, why does that make me out of my mind? He goes, it makes no sense. It makes no sense whatsoever. Now, on some level, he actually had a shared perspective on many, many, many people in academics. I've had people run up to me, screaming at me, literally, that I'm reversing science with this interpersonal neurobiology stuff, which is about to tell you this offering where the mind is not embedded inside the head. What's the system? What's the system that this mind is all about? Now, again, I'm not saying subjective experience of consciousness, maybe, maybe not. That's up for some study of the mind and life folks, or researchers who are looking for the neural correlates of consciousness or whatever. That's cool. Maybe it's overlap, maybe not. But there's a third aspect of mind that is absolutely both embodied and relational. Energy. Very good. Thank you. Good. One of my online students. No. So energy. Energy, the nervous system is all about electrochemical energy flow. Electrochemical energy flow is what the nervous system is all about. It's beautiful, it's intricate, it's a mystery, it's fantastic. Studying it is so important. And the researchers that do it have unbelievably ingenious ways of getting at the subtle fine points that we'll talk about in a moment. Energy and information flow is essentially what the nervous system is about in its beautiful, elegant, mysterious, wonderful ways. And what is a relationship? What's happening between me and you right now? Energy is coming at you. I could do that and it would be just energy, or I could say, you know, Garrison Institute, and it'd be energy with information. Information is always carried along waves of energy or patterns of energy flow that have symbolic value. That's what information is. An energy pattern with symbolic value. It has meaning besides the sound. Garrison Institute is this place. It's not the sound Garrison Institute, but that doesn't have symbolic value. Or if I speak a language you don't speak, like Greek, glikanara, you don't know what that means if you don't speak Greek. It's just Greek to you, right? But if you're from Greece, you know it's an unbelievably cool nudist beach on Crete, where you live in caves, and if you're 25, it's a lot of fun. I don't know if I'd go there now. But so information is always carried along. Energy is not some mysterious thing. As one professor came and yelled at me and screamed at me, he said, "You are an idiot." I said, "Why am I an idiot?" He said, "Because you're using the word energy." I said, "Okay." I said, "Why does that make me an idiot?" He goes, "It's the most unscientific idea ever." I said, "Is physics a branch of science?" So I'm not talking about something mysterious and, you know, totally out there. I'm talking about literally, I'm talking about sound waves of air molecules moving, hitting your tympanic membrane, making basically the kinetic energy of air molecules moving, that's energy, turn into electrochemical energy transformations, which is what the brain does. That's all it does, in many ways. Okay, so energy is not something we're saying is wacky and wild. It's beautiful and wonderful, and it's real. It's scientific. It's what physicists study. And energy is always what information is carried on. And I can say always because I met with one of the leading experts in cognitive psychology, the father of the field, and I spent a long time with him just saying, is there any information you've ever studied that doesn't ride along energy patterns? And he said, absolutely not. Anyway, okay. So we're saying it's energy and information flow that's embodied and it's relational. Now, here's the thing. Is your mental experience open to influences from outside of your personal life? Yes. And does your life ever become chaotic? Yes, like mine was this morning when I broke my toe. Yes. Yeah, so if you see me hobbling, you'll know why. It's hard to go to the restroom in the dark and smash your toe and something. Yes, yes. I need a little sympathy this morning. So anyway, okay. So energy and information flow can be chaotic, and it happens. We are open, and small inputs to your life can lead to large and unpredictable results. Is that true? So you are nonlinear, that's what that means, nonlinear. You are chaos capable, and you are open to influences from outside of your personal sphere. Those three criteria make you a complex system. Now that doesn't mean you're complicated, it just means from a mathematical point of view, you're called a complex system. Okay, now complex systems, straight out of math, it's not a California term or anything, it's out of the probability theory of mathematics, says that if you're a complex system, you have this amazing thing called an emergent property. Emergent properties are not intuitive, and this is where I think the field of mental health and education understandably, including the philosophy of mind, understandably have not come up with a definition of the mind, because I'm going to suggest to you that the mind is an emergent process that's arising from energy and information flow both within you and between you. Within you is the body stuff, we'll call it the brain, but it's really the whole body. And it's between you in your relationship with other people and the planet itself. And that mind, this third aspect of mind, not subjective experience, not consciousness, we're not explaining those away, we're putting those to the side for now. This third aspect of mind we are defining as a self-organizing emergent process. See, self-organization is the emergent property of complex systems. And the totally non-intuitive thing about self-organization is that it arises from something, the substance of the system, and then it turns back and organizes that from which it arose, which totally doesn't make any sense, but it's actually what happens. It's called recursivity. It's recursive. It arises from the interaction of the elements of the system, and it comes back and organizes those elements. That's not me making it up. That is pure math. It's called self-organization, and if I didn't hang around with physicists, 150 of them for a week one time, drilling them about self-organization, I wouldn't feel so sure about it because the math is not so easy to read. But self-organization is real. It's a mathematical principle. It's not some wacky California thing I'm telling you. It's pure math. Okay, so what I'm suggesting is the mind can be defined, one aspect of the mind, this third aspect of the mind, as a self-organizing, which means it's emergent, but we'll say emergent just because it's a cool word, self-organizing emergent process that is both embodied and relational, and that's the key thing. It's embodied and relational, and this pisses off American staunch individualists. They think this is an anti-American definition. I swear, I'm not joking about that. I own my mind, Dan. How dare you say it's relational? I guess our relationship has bothered you, hasn't it, So it is un-American. If you think Americanism is that the self is defined by the skin, then yes, this definition of mind is absolutely anti-American. If the self is defined by your skin and you live an encapsulated life and you have no interdependence and interconnectedness and interbeingness, as Thich Nhat Hanh would say, or interconnectedness, or any of the way in which, if you really want to live a life where you are totally isolated, then this is an anti-you definition. But if you want to be consistent with the science, I think this is an accurate definition. So here it goes. A self-organizing, emergent, embodied, and relational process. And what does this process do? And here's the key thing we're going to talk about for the rest of the talk. It regulates the flow of energy and information. A self-organizing process is regulating that from which it arose. We've already defined that from which it arose, which is what? Energy. Energy flow. Sometimes the energy is in the form of information, so we're just going to say the phrase energy and information. It's a little redundant. My daughter would probably be not happy with that, because all information is energy, but not all energy is information. So we'll just say energy and information flow. So formally, you would say energy and the forms of energy that have symbolic value we call information, but we'll just say that's information. Okay. So to really look at, let's say, my field of attachment research, we ask the question, what kind of patterns of energy and information flow create a healthy family environment that optimize the development of the child's brain? And I'll suggest to you, now here's one of the major first take-home points. What does this definition do for education? Who cares? Is it just an academic issue to come up with a definition of the mind and then get people angry at you from all the different fields of academics because they don't have a definition and a lot of them think you shouldn't have one? Is that what it's about, just fighting with people? Or is it actually useful? So here's where I want to suggest to you this is a useful definition that can transform the field of education. And this is this idea of internal education. Whatever you want to call it, taking time in, reflecting, mindfulness, whatever you want to call it, I see all these efforts, these incredibly important efforts people are making, as overlapping in the following way. If you see the mind in this way of having a definition, which is it's regulatory, to regulate something, like regulating a car, you got to see where you're going and shape that thing. You got to monitor and modify. You can have your students, starting in kindergarten or earlier, be given regular curricula that teach them to monitor the internal world, to monitor the interpersonal world, because those are the two places the mind is. It's within and between. So internal education doesn't just mean inside your body. It means inside the relationship. It means inside the other person. It means inside wherever energy and information is flowing. This is what they're monitoring. And then modifying in a specific way we'll get to in just a moment. So here's the idea. You can take a practice, however you want to creatively invent it for your own classroom, or if you want to draw on the incredibly important work, let's say, of CASEL. We have Mark Greenberg here, who runs that organization. CASEL is all about social emotional learning, the Consortium for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning. Social emotional learning, I don't think say it this way, but we can have a discussion with Mark and see, but at least Dan Goldman, who's a part of that group, feels that mind sight, this ability to sense energy and information flow within you and between you, I just use the word mind sight for short, seeing the mind. This ability to monitor energy information flow and modulate it in a particular way is called mind sight. Dan Goldman has said, in the foreword to the book called Mind Sight, that mind sight is the fundamental mechanism of social and emotional learning. And you can teach mind sight. Right? So what does that mean? It means you are teaching to monitor energy and information flow and modulate it in a certain kind of way. But let's stay with the monitoring first. Here's a way to think about it. The fundamental process, this is now your second take-home point. We now have a definition of the mind. That's the first one, and we're going to look at its implication. What is the process that we talk about that actually shapes energy and information flow within you and between you? What do we call that? It has a really common name. It's attention, right? It's not awareness, it's attention. Attention is that process that is directing energy and information flow, right? And what do we know helps stabilize attention, especially when it's within awareness, where we call it working memory? What do we know is a research-proven way to stabilize, if you will, the camera lens with which you're directing energy and information flow? Mindfulness, okay? Just in terms of adults, we have a couple of studies in kids, but the robust studies are in adults. You can show that working memory is increased, the ability to not get distracted by things is increased. We did a pilot study, it needs to do a follow-up, but we did a pilot study at UCLA with older adolescents and adults with attention problems, and we taught them mindfulness meditation over 8 weeks. We got better improvements in their ability to focus energy and information flow, called attention, than you get with medications. Now, it shouldn't be that surprising because as we get to this regulation part, this second take-home point, how you drive energy and information flow through the brain changes the connections in the brain. And that's something, we postulated 10 years ago, and people thought it was kind of a wild statement that many of us were making, and now we know it's true. It's called neuroplasticity, and it happens throughout the lifespan. So what you do in education is, in a classroom, a teacher is driving energy and information flow through the brain. And so you can certainly drive it filled with facts and figures and stuff like that, or you can learn very learnable techniques to not just stick facts and figures into a kid's head, but actually train the very circuits of attention. Let's think about it in this way. Most of us have a camera lens that's jumpy. And there are a number of techniques, let's just talk about mindfulness, which basically stabilize the jumpy camera that's bringing in energy and information flow into awareness. That's awareness we'll get to in just a moment. So you as a teacher can actually say, every day I am going to do a 2-minute, 3-minute, 5-minute, 10-minute, whatever you're going to do, practice to stabilize attention. Bless you. The simplest way of doing it, the simplest way, which costs absolutely nothing, is the breath. Everybody breathes, but not everybody learns the incredibly simple skill of focusing on the breath. And when the breath happens in and out, it gets pretty boring, so of course you get distracted, other thoughts, and then you have to redirect your attention to the breath. Now, why is that a cool thing to do? Well, William James, over 100 years ago, said, this would be the education par excellence if you could just take a wandering attention and return it again and again. And they said the problem is we don't know how to do that. Well, there is a practice called mindfulness meditation that in the Buddhist tradition has been worked on for 2,500 years. Back when William James said no one knew how to do it, it was 2,400 years. But, but this is where you have to get people talking with each other. So focusing on the breath is a brain training exercise. It is not a religious practice. It's actually done in most cultures. Mindfulness is found in virtually every culture. How being aware of the present moment helps. Now, we're going to talk about stabilizing attention. And if you just think about it in a simple way, focusing on the breath, your mind wanders, you say, oh, I'm aware of my awareness. I'm thinking about dinner. I'm paying attention to my intention. My intention is to focus on the breath for these 3 minutes or 5 minutes, whatever. I've got to redirect my attention. So it's like a muscle. You contract your muscle for the focusing of attention. You get distracted, it's the relaxing of the muscle. You focus, you contract your muscle. It's a way of training the attention circuits of the brain, literally. Why we're not doing this with kids in classrooms is a mystery. Now, I would agree with Mark Greenberg's stance that in Castle, we have to have empirical evidence that it helps. For sure, we do. And so we need a branch of what we do that is unbelievably strictly scientific. But I can tell you, and I'll ask Mark later on, most of what happens in a classroom is not scientifically proven at all to do anything, right? Is that true? So why not at least do something that is actually going to likely be doing something totally different and help? Because, you know what I mean? And then let's study it too, for sure. It's not one or the other. But otherwise you'd go into a teacher and say, no one ever said saying good morning is helpful. Prove to me that if you didn't say it, it would be maybe even better, And it's this way, I can tell you, it's this way in therapy all the time. As an educator in the world of mental health, people always say, where's your, what do they call them? Evidence-based thing that being kind to a patient is good. And I go, yeah, you're right. I don't know of a double-blind study that says being a nasty jerk versus a kind person. No one's ever done that study, so I'll try it out. So anyway, but seriously, we need people who do the empirical research so we can be really strong in it, for sure. But I don't think we need to wait. I don't think we need to wait. And it's so simple to do, you know. So we need both going at once. Okay, so that's the monitoring part is really important. So that's the second take-home point. We made a definition of the mind, first take-home point. And now the practical application, the second take-home point is you can have teachers teach the monitoring skill of energy information flow within and between, right? Now, Linda's going to tell me I have 5 minutes left because I'm monitoring her. But I just want to point out that in mindfulness, you're aware of awareness, which is really cool, and you're paying attention to intention. And that beautiful tree that Laura showed and that Mark showed from the Contemplative Mind and Society, you know, it may be that one way of defining a mindfulness practice, this is just one way we do it at UCLA, is you're aware of awareness and paying attention to intention. And however you do that is really good. And in the book I wrote called The Mindful Brain, I say why I think that helps exercise these circuits in the brain. Okay, let's get to take-home point number 3 in the next 5 minutes. We'll do it. So fine, okay, so in all the different ways, let's say using mindfulness as an example, but there's lots of other ways to do it. You want to not just give kids fasting figures, you want to help them stabilize attention. Okay, so now what they see is more stable, so they see with more depth, clarity, and detail. It's that simple. It's just like a camera, and if it's all shaky when you take the picture, then when you look at the video, it's like a mess, right? And you can't really edit it too well. So now we're getting to the third take-home and the last take-home point for this talk, which is monitoring and modifying, the modifying part. I'm going to say some completely outrageous things that you're going to think are nutty, just like you probably think everything else I just said is nutty. But if you look at all the different sciences, and when we wrote, I rewrote The Developing Mind, the second edition of it, I had 15 interns with me. I said, your job is to disprove the first edition, which came out in '99, prove that that whole book is wrong, let's rewrite the whole field. They said, what? I said, yeah, prove everything that was said in that is wrong. And 15 of them. And we spent months and months and months doing this together. It was incredible. And I can say to you with even more excitement than I said with the first edition, now with the second edition after we did this process, the following statement. Integration is health. Integration is health. Integration is defined, and you're probably thinking I'm a definition nut, but it's always good to have clear definitions about what we're saying. Definition of integration is the linkage of differentiated parts. So for the mind discussion we're having, since the mind is both embodied and relational, let's start with relationships. When I honor the difference between me and you, that's the differentiated part of our relationship, but then I cultivate compassionate communication, that's the linkage part. Honoring differences, cultivating compassionate communication is the linkage. That's an integrated relationship. People who have integrated relationships in their life have better physiological health, they have better psychological health, they actually live longer. For kids early in life, that's basically the fastest way of summarizing the entire field of attachment is it's based on integrated relationships. Integrated communication between a parent and a child leads to the child being seen, feeling safe, being soothed, and being secure, the 4 S's of attachment. They're seen, safe, soothed, and secure. That's an integrated relationship. Okay, so without going into all the drama of it, but you can certainly read the book, let me give you the implication of this. The modulating part, once you've stabilized monitoring, is to always move energy and information flow toward integration. If you're talking about your body, what that means is you're honoring what's coming up literally from your heart, the intrinsic neural network in the organ called the heart, the neural network in your intestines, what's coming from your muscles and your bones and your lungs and the whole body, all that stuff coming upward through the lamina 1, layer 1 of the spinal cord and up through the 10th cranial nerve. It all comes up higher up into the brain to various filtering of the thalamus and through the brainstem, through the limbic area, not through the thalamus for this region, then up into the higher parts of the brain. That's called vertical integration. So when you see people who aren't aware of the wisdom of the body, they're not vertically integrated, their life is compromised. And when life is compromised because you don't have integration internally, this would be vertical integration. You can also have left-right integration. You can have memory integration. There are 9 domains of integration we talk about, which are all teachable. And in the developing mind, you'll see them in the mindful therapist, which could be called the mindful teacher. It teaches you how to develop them yourself. In the whole brain child, it teaches you how to do this with kids and how to help integrate the child's brain and relationships. Integration, when it's present, is harmony. It's flexibility, adaptability. It's a mathematical term called coherence. It's energized, it's stable. That spells FACES, F-A-C-E-S, flexible, adaptive, coherent, energized, and stable. That's the flow of an integrated system, whether the system is the body or relationships or our relationship with the planet. So the reason I work with the different initiatives here at the Garrison Institute is because all of them are about integration and its impairment. Because when integration is present, it's harmony, which is what we're trying to do on the planet. It's what we're trying to do with workers who work with traumatized people in that initiative. It's what we're trying to do here in contemplative education. It's all about integration. Mindfulness, for example, is one of the most profoundly integrative practices. When you're not integrated, you go to chaos or rigidity. And when you're integrated, you move from those banks of chaos and rigidity into the river of harmony. And there's a huge amount to support that statement. But let me give you just 2 examples, and then I'm going to close. Mindfulness. Let me just give you the incredible findings from the study of mostly adults in mindfulness. Number 1, it improves working memory. It takes a neural circuit called the default mode, and it makes it more integrated. In Brewer's work, you can see that. The default mode is this kind of resting state of the brain. In the brain, just to give you an example of what I mean by integration, Norman Farb and colleagues in Toronto found that we have what wisdom traditions have known for thousands of years, but of course it's always cool when neuroscience supports what they knew already. But anyway, there is a circuit, a midline circuit, that's an observing witness. And there's a more peripheral, both sides of the brain, sensing circuit. So when you do this beautiful thing that Mark did this morning of sensing the breath, okay, you're inviting yourself, or if you do this with students, let's say breath awareness, say, I want you to stay for a moment with the sensation of the breath. And then you're distinguishing the sensory circuit, so you're differentiating it, from an incredibly chattering observing circuit, which is default mode, which is usually going, oh, what should I do? I'm not good at this. I'm not a good meditator, blah, blah, blah. And so you say, no, just sense the breath. No, I'm not good at sensing the breath. Just sense the breath. But I'm not good. So you're differentiating an observing circuit from a sensing circuit. And in the beautiful work of Amishi Jha, and we were teaching together to a whole bunch of superintendents for public schools in the United States just a couple weeks ago, and so we kind of had this sort of tag team set of talks we did, but Amishi beautifully was summarizing the overall findings, and she looked at something called mind wandering. And this observing circuit can get your mind to wander all the time. So a student is in class and starts saying, well, I should do this and do that, and blah, 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 blah. That's the observing circuit. Instead of being with the experiencing sensing circuit, just being with the teacher. Mindfulness decreases mind wandering. And mind wandering, if you believe the study by Gilbert and his colleague at Harvard, is the cause of unhappiness. It's also the cause of a kid not paying attention in school. And mind wandering, I'm not talking about where you sit and say, I'm going to give myself permission now to let my mind wander. That wouldn't be called mind wandering. This is where you're unintentionally letting your mind explore. Mindfulness decreases mind wandering. Mindfulness differentiates these 2 circuits and allows you to literally integrate them. So when I say mindfulness is one of the most integrative practices, I'm not just using that as a loose California, let's all love each other kind of thing. I literally mean mindfulness enables you to differentiate a number of different circuits. This is just one I'm highlighting. You're differentiating sensing from observing, and then you're honoring both. And you stabilize the observing circuit. So these mindfulness studies actually show that you have a still inner place created. Now, I'll invite you to do this practice. This is the last thing I'm going to say, and then I'm going to stop, called the Wheel of Awareness practice. So if you go to my website, drdansiegel.com, drdansiegel.com, and just for free, you can click on resources, and if you've never done the breath practice there, it's under Mindsight Practices, but go to the Wheel of Awareness and try it out yourself, because we're doing this now in a number of different schools, and the results are pretty fantastic, where if you differentiate in this wheel, there's an outer rim and an inner hub. And in this practice that we do with kids as young as kindergarten, they experience the differentiation of the hub, which represents the knowing of awareness. And the rim is anything which can be known, and a spoke is attention, different from awareness. Awareness is a sense of knowing, and it can have the sense of what is known, which is on the rim. And you move this spoke around systematically to the outside world representations of sight and hearing, etc., to the inside world of what would be called like a body scan, to the world of mental processes like feelings and thoughts and memories and things like that, and then even to something we call the eighth sense, which is your sense of relatedness to other people and the planet. Because we do have a relational sense. First five senses bring in the outside world. Sixth sense is the sense of the body. Seventh sense is the sense of mental life. But the eighth sense is incredibly important. And this is what I'm going to close with. With this practice, what we've found is that the human brain's sad vulnerability to erroneously define the self as limited to the skin begins to be loosened up with this practice, as it is with mindfulness practices too. And that if there is any hope for our species and for what we're doing to this planet, it must be that in families and in schools, that what Einstein called the delusion that we are separate from each other, that we live in these skin-encapsulated selves, has got to be loosened. You know, there's a word that I'm playing with all my students called MWE, M-W-E. So it's not that we get rid of, I have to take care of my body, I've got to exercise, I've got to enjoy this life, I've got to do what I have to do. But there's also an identity as a we. So it's not giving up the me to go to we, but it's we, right? I told my editor, the next book I write is called We. She goes, I don't think so. I said, I think so, so we'll see what happens. But if you think about it, everything we need to do is to support the emergence of an awareness within an individual, within classrooms, within schools, within communities, within the larger society, within our planetary interconnected world we live in, that we are all profoundly interconnected. And here's the absolutely amazing stance that emerges from all this. This is the last thing I'll say, and then we'll close and take a break. When integration is made visible, whether it's in your body or in your relationships, when integration happens, when it's made visible, it's kindness and compassion. Integration made visible is kindness and compassion. And so if you're trying to support health of the individual, health of the family, health of the school, health of the community, health of our planet, then teaching people to monitor energy information flow and move that flow toward integration is exactly what we need to do. And together, we can do it. So thank you very much for your attention.